I'm going to mix up some colours, starting with the sky colours. So I'm using Cerulean. I'm mixing up a nice puddle of Cerulean. I'm using my size 4 brush, so I've got some control about the colour mixing. A larger brush, you add too much colour, and a smaller one, you don't get enough colour. So I quite like the 4 or size 6. I find the most useful. So just make sure you get a nice big puddle. Now I'm mixing up a little bit of Quinacridone Magenta here. You could use Permanent Rose or any pink will do. And really, it's not really in the sky, but I'm kind of using it as a barrier between the blue and that sort of yellow on the horizon. I don't want that's a really good blue for going green. So the pink will stop that blue from turning the yellow green. And I'm using Quinacridone Gold, but you could use yellow ochre or raw sienna. And I'm wetting the sky area with the large flat brush. Really give it a good soak. The longer you let it soak and the water to soak in, the longer you have to paint. I'm just going very, very carefully around the little cabin, the roof there, because there's snow on it. I don't want any water on there, otherwise it will run on there. So what you don't wet will stay dry. I'm applying the Cerulean now with my size 10 round black velvet brush. And I'm just sort of gliding the paint on. Always make sure you really load your brush, especially when you're painting a sky. Just keep loading it each time. I'm just making the paint slightly darker. It was a bit pale. And what I'm doing is I'm just going down now, heading towards the middle of the sky. And as you notice, I'm not actually picking up any paint there. I've left it sort of just with the water on the paper, so it's getting lighter towards the horizon. I just add a little bit of pink there, just below that white area, just to act as that barrier, which is quite effective. And now I'm adding the Quinacridone Gold, wet into wet, sort of on the pink and below. And I'm painting this with my size 10 brush. I'm mixing up some creamier Quinacridone Gold and painting this damp into wet, and you can see that colour just rush up. I don't want it to rush up too far because it's going to run up into my sky, and that's why one is I've got it on a tilt, and two, I've made it slightly creamier so it doesn't move as fast. But if you find it's running up too much, just tilt your board or paper a little bit more. So I'm just giving that a little tilt as well, just to get everything sort of moving. And it's really nice to do as well, because you're not actually touching it with your brush. You're just allowing the paint to do its own thing. I've mixed up some creamy burnt sienna. So I'm just painting this with my size 4 brush, damp into wet. If your paper's dried a bit, you can do it damp into damp. I just want to make sure that using the damp paint sort of creates these sort of different sections so they don't all run into each other. Yes. I mixed up Ultramarine and burnt sienna and Ultramarine and Quinacridone Gold. I'm using my size 10 brush and I'm painting damp into damp, and I just want to make sure the paint doesn't move at all here. And I'm just painting a little bit of that Christmas tree, which I moved a little bit more nearer to the cabin, just to create sort of a little bit more interest and balance. Now there's a lot of painting here for this area. There's wet into wet, there's damp into wet, and now there's damp into damp. If you look in my palette, that paint is almost neat. It's really creamy, there's hardly any water, and that way you've got lots of control and the paint doesn't move. And I just want to paint these darker areas in the painting, in these trees. There's some lovely darks there, and I'm using the size 4 brush, just carefully painting around the top of the cabin with some nice darks. It just really pops that snow-capped rooftop, which is the focal point of our little painting here, and it really brings it out, and it's my lightest light against my darkest dark. And I'm just using this size 4 brush, painting damp into damp, just those background trees. is my synthetic sponge. I'm going to wet it, wring all the water out, and I'm going to use a kitchen towel just to make sure I get all of that excess water out of there. And then I'm going to dip it into some of the paints that I use for the darker trees, the Ultramarine mixed with Quinacridone Gold, or the Ultramarine mixed with burnt sienna, and I'm painting this sort of on the damp paint, so there's not very much wet paint on my sponge because you don't want that then to dilute what you've done, but it's just really to give some textures at the top of those trees, just to make them look a little bit more natural. And I quite like the effect, but I don't want to do too much. I just want to do a little bit towards the top. So once you finish your sponging, mix up some really dark green paint. So I'm using the Ultramarine and the Quinacridone Gold, and I'm going to paint this Christmas tree here, and I'm using my size 4 brush, and I'm painting this. I mean, the surface is now drying off, but because the paint is so creamy, there's hardly any water in this mix. There's no danger of backruns or anything like that, but just keep getting fresh creamy paint. And if you're at all worried about this, you can wait for it to dry and then paint this tree wet on dry as well. As you come towards the bottom of the tree, just make some bigger marks. As you notice, the foliage goes up towards the sky at the top, and it's sort of more sort of horizontal in the middle and then kind of goes down at the bottom. So it's quite nice just to get that characteristic of the tree as well. I'm using the corner of my plastic card. The paint is damp. The sheen hasn't gone yet, so I can pull off paint. And I always think it's good to practice this technique before you go into your painting with it. But I'm putting lots and lots of light coloured tree trunks in there just to give a little bit of light and detail and texture as well. I've wet the snow area in the foreground all the way up to the cabin, and you can see there I'm mixing a little bit of cerulean, a touch of pink and a tiny touch of burnt sienna, very, very watered down, and painting this with my size 10 brush, wet into wet, leaving gaps. It's a little bit like painting a sky and leaving some white gaps so it looks like the light on the snow. I'm wetting this little strip of water here on the right hand side. I'm using my size 2 brush, but you could use the 4 as well. It's just, I made it actually a little bit wider because I thought it'd really balance out well with the cabin on the right hand side, and I wanted it to really reflect those trees, which it does in the photograph, but I really wanted to exaggerate that. That's the beauty of a painting. We kind of can change things. You can put things in, take things out. It's great. I love the freedom of it. I'm actually painting some creamy Quinacridone Gold, damp into wet, and the reason why it's damp is because I don't want it to spread too much, because I want to put other darks in there, but I also want to keep my light in the water as well. So this paint's very creamy here. It's the Ultramarine with a Quinacridone Gold. I'm using the size 2 brush so I don't overload and put too much paint in because it's quite a small area, and I'm putting a little bit of the Ultramarine and the burnt sienna in, so it's basically reflecting those background trees, and it just gives a little pop of colour in that blanket of snow, and it's very, very effective. And just at the top there at the riverbank, or the little strip of water there, I'm just putting really neat dark colour, and that's the Ultramarine and the burnt sienna, just to really have that dark and light against the snow and then the dark of the water. I'm mixing up some cerulean now with a little bit of the ultramarine, a tiny touch of the burnt sienna, and I'm painting this very pale colour damp into damp. Make sure you leave lots of gaps so you've got the light on top of the snow, which is quite important. I mixed up a little bit of the cerulean, a touch of the burnt sienna, a little bit of the ultramarine, and a tiny touch of the pink just to make this grey violet. And I took the excess off on my kitchen towel, so my brush, as you can see there, it's not going to be too wet, so I can actually mark out a little path here, and I've just got a little bit more of the ultramarine there just to make it slightly stronger. And remember to take a little bit excess off there on your kitchen towel or tissue, and I'm painting this damp into damp with my size 10 brush. And this path is just to lead your eye into the painting. I'm mixing up a little bit of a stronger colour of the ultramarine, a tiny touch of pink in there as well, just so to make some darker marks in the foreground, damp into damp. This path doesn't actually exist on the photograph, but I thought it was a really good artistic tool to lead the eye in and to create depth. So I'm just using this size 10 here just to create some little marks on the left hand side of this little snowy path, and I'm just softening this little bit on the right here. I felt it was a little bit strong, so I'm just softening away so it doesn't stand out too much, and I did the same on the left hand side. I'm mixing up some burnt sienna now. I'm using my size 4 brush. It's quite a watery wash to begin with, and I'm going to paint the little cabin just wet on dry, just being careful that I don't sort of get any paint on that lovely snowy roof. So I'm really sort of making sure I paint as slow as I can, and I don't want to get any on the snow underneath either. Here's a close-up of the people. It's just sort of, it's something out of my imagination. They're very, very tiny. It's literally a little soft rectangle at the top, a tiny pointy triangle at the bottom, and the dog is literally a little arch with a little waggy tail. I've kept it really, really simple, but it's nice just to have something in the distance. You don't have to paint them, but I do think it adds something to it, and I put a little bit of shadow underneath them as well with that sort of path colour. Painting in the cabin's windows now with my size 4 brush, wet on dry. I'm using a mixture of ultramarine and burnt sienna. It gives you this lovely dark brown, and I decided to put some windows and doors in the front of the cabin as well, just to finish off quite nicely there. And I'm putting a little bit of shadow on the snow rooftop here, just at the bottom area, using some of the leftover shadow colour that I use for the snow. I'm just putting in some darks and details on the cabin, on the woodwork there. I'm going to let it dry off, and I'm going to put a thin glaze of ultramarine and burnt sienna on the right hand side of the cabin, as I'm doing now, just to show the lights coming from the left. Mixing up a puddle of paint, and I'm going to spatter my painting now with white paint. You don't have to do this. I just wanted to have some fun and make it look a little bit more like a Christmas card. So I've removed the framing tape, and here is the finished painting. I did a little bit more spattering. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you'd like to see more like it, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, where you'll get updates of my latest tutorials. And if you'd like to get access to my exclusive weekly tutorials, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.